There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
The light squared bishop on d3 for a trade, preventing white from getting what would normally be potentially very good attacking chances over here.
I love chess. Now, I have ever since I learned how to play when I was about 6 years old. Now, I'm no expert, not by any stretch of the imagination. My friend John, whom I used to beat all the time, is now unbeatable. His defensive strategy is impenetrable, and when he sees an opportunity, he goes on the offense. I can see it coming when it happens, but I'm defenseless to stop it. And before I know it, all I have left is my king and a knight. That's if I'm lucky. And from there, it's all downhill.
Hikaru plays bishop to d6 and is offering a trade right back at Magnus.
It's about strategy. I have to decide early on in the game what mine will be. Do I go with an early offense, hoping to quickly control the board, or do I focus on building a defensive wall? The thing is, my friend's game has evolved, and mine hasn't. Not by much. He's read about the various gambits, he's tried them out, and he's learned which ones work for him, and he's built his game around those. Even though I've been playing for decades, I wouldn't know a queen's gambit from a king's gambit. My strategy is simple. I study the board and I formulate a counter for every move while I look for opportunities. That used to work. It doesn't now. If, instead of chess, this were a struggle for survival, I'd be out of luck. And pieces.
Checkmate.
By now, you're probably wondering if you've hit play on the wrong podcast. What does any of this have to do with evolution or science? It's all about selecting the right strategy to survive. As in chess, where one has to decide early on what strategy to use, so too it is in life. Or at least life when it comes to living long enough to replicate and pass your genes down to your offspring. Now let's step away from the chessboard and focus instead on something a little more explosive.
Good evening. 3 days after the eruption of Mount St. Helens in southwest Washington state, imponderables dust the air like volcanic ash. 10 persons are known dead, 71 are missing, and one estimate is that it will take more than $150 million.
Now, I was a boy when Mount St. Helens erupted. That happened in 1980. And as a kid, I was amazed to learn there were even volcanoes in the United States, let alone ones that were still active. Now, it was devastating to the environment, as you can imagine. The initial blast covered an area said to have been over 200 miles. A second blast shot ash and gas 12 miles into the air. And when the dust settled, 90 square miles of forest was lost. An environment rich in wildlife was gone. So what now? What happens then? Now, if you were somehow in control of repopulating and regenerating an area that had essentially been wiped clean of life, how would you do it? With limited resources at your disposal, would you decide to throw all of your effort into producing as many offspring as possible, as quickly as possible, and toss them out there onto the now barren playing field to fend for themselves? Or would you take a different tactic and produce a couple offspring, protecting and nourishing them until they can take care of themselves? Now, both strategies might work, and that's what nature had to do. It had two strategies to choose from. They are known as the R and the K selection strategies. Now, before I go any further with this, I know nature isn't consciously selecting what strategy to use, but it's a fun way to look at it. And when it comes to repopulating an environment devastated by natural disaster, it's a bit more complicated than simply picking one of two selection strategies. But the explosion of Mount St. Helens is a perfect board to play our little game of survival chess on. The R&K strategies were first identified in 1967 by ecologists E.O. Wilson and Robert MacArthur. The R stands for reproduction. Simple enough. But the K refers to carrying capacity, or the maximum amount of offspring which an environment can support. Now, why a K for capacity? The K stands for the German word for capacity. I won't even try to say it out of respect for my German listeners.
Kapazitätsgrenzen.
There you go. So, what are the differences between the two? Now, I'm going to generalize the differences because there are exceptions. Life as we know it is full of exceptions.
After a6, e3, and bishop f5, we have...
Okay, no more chess. Organisms who are R-strategists are typically small, fast, and flood the environment with offspring. They also have short lifespans. The R-strategist will use up all of its energy and resources to accomplish this. The more the merrier is pretty much their motto. Think of frogs. Frogs are R-selected. Mice are as well. They're small, and they produce as many offspring as possible, hoping that some will survive to keep the species going. Now, organisms which are K-selected employ a different tactic. An elephant would be a great example of this, and it resides on the opposite end of the spectrum than, say, mice. Now, elephants are large, slow, have long lifespans, and give birth to one calf at a time. They care for their calves and they protect them. Bears do too. Mama bears will ferociously protect their cubs. K-strategists thrive in stable environments. They prefer it. All of their resources, time, and energy go into protecting and raising their young. They live as close to the carrying capacity as the environment will allow. So back to Mount St. Helens and the aftermath of the explosion. Given what you know now, what organisms do you think moved in after the eruption? Now remember, the resources are low and the environment is unstable. So I'll give you a moment. If you said R-selected organisms, you're right. The area around the mountain had a rich lake and pond habitat prior to the eruption. Afterward, that area was quickly populated by amphibians, plants, plankton, and insects. All R-selected organisms. They took advantage of the fact that there weren't large predators present. It was all theirs. For a while anyway. It wasn't until later that the larger K-selected animals moved in. Now that there were small animals and plants to eat, the K-selected animals found it all stable enough to enjoy. Life finds a way, to quote a certain scientist played by Jeff Goldblum in an extremely obscure little movie nobody has ever heard of called Jurassic Park. Now, to briefly differentiate between them again, R-selected organisms typically have short lifespans, are small, and mature fast given those short lifespans. They produce a lot of small offspring, which they tend to leave to fend for themselves. K-selected organisms are large, strong, live longer, and they produce small litters which they produce at a much later age. They care for their offspring and are usually more intelligent than the smaller, weaker R-selected organisms, whom they often feed upon.
We're here to make sure you have a safe and comfortable flight. We do thank you for your attention. Please keep in mind that the
Not too long ago, my wife and I flew to Washington State to visit family. We saw Mount St. Helens as we passed overhead. 40 years later, and that mountain is surrounded by green forests populated by elk, deer, American black bears, and the occasional mountain lion. Life around the mountain has come a long way, but it is still recovering. Life really does find a way. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material used for this episode at evolutiontalk.com. I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.